Hello, and welcome to episode 49 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where we interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. We're here today with Christina Betancourt Johnson, Executive Director of Rebuilding Together, Montgomery County. How are you doing today, Christina?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, Jordan.
I'm happy to have you here. So the first question I'd like to ask you is, what are you currently doing, or what have you ever done to advance the public interest, and why?
So professionally here in Montgomery County, I transform the lives of low-income homeowners by providing them with safe and healthy homes. And we do this through revitalization at Rebuilding Together Montgomery County. But day to day, I try to advance the public good by being a good human being. And that includes not only being great to the people that I work with, but great to family members, the people with whom I come into contact day to day, and certainly raising my 7-year-old to be a good humanitarian.
So what exactly is going through your mind when you're trying to raise your 7-year-old to be a good humanitarian? How do you inculcate that sensibility in your daughter?
You know, it's pretty easy. My daughter's name is Vivian, and she's a pretty calm human being. But, you know, it's funny. John F. Kennedy once called upon us to demonstrate our decency of purpose, our steadfastness of resolve, and the strength of will we inherit from our forefathers. And I think that each and every day, whether it's that quote that drives me or sort of an inherent desire to serve other people because of how I was raised in my home, I think I try to instill core values of compassion, consideration, service, honesty, and integrity in my daughter. And I think that sort of permeates our household and how we live and the way we treat other people. And the school that she goes to actually also embraces those values, or very similar values. And so she's getting it day to day, and she sees it in the way that I behave. And then she turns around and mimics it. You know, kids learn from their environment, and they do what they see.
And how was it instilled in you? Were you also once a 7-year-old girl who had parents or mentors who instilled the similar things in you?
Yeah, I would say so. So my mother's name is Vicki Betancourt. My dad's name is James Johnson. So my parents actually are not from Washington, D.C., though I am a native Washingtonian, was born here. My father was born in Saluda, Virginia, which is Southern Virginia. He was an African-American man. He's 73 years old. He's still alive. I shouldn't say was. He is. But I think he grew up in a time where his civil rights were sort of not permitted, I guess, and restricted in many ways. And my mother is a Cuban-American immigrant. She's a white Cuban-American immigrant. And she came here as a young child with her family to Dallas, Texas. And as a young Cuban-American who did not speak English in Dallas, it was very, very difficult for her to assimilate into the culture. And she was treated as sort of a third-rate citizen. And I think between her parents' values and my father's parents' values, both which sort of, I think, premised on hard work, respect, honesty, civility. They sort of started to pass that on to me. And when they sort of joined forces as a married unit, they thought it very important to teach me those same values and principles. And so, yeah, I would say that my parents had a lot to do with sort of who I am today and how I behave. My dad was an attorney. He was a criminal defense attorney. And my mother worked for a very long time in the philanthropic space. But I think both of them taught me how to always respect people, regardless of where they come from and who they are or what they can do for you. My father taught me the importance of respecting people who had even, been seen in the eyes of the public as less than, because he dealt with a lot of criminals. But he showed me that everybody has a sense of decency to them, and you have to sort of seek that out if you don't see it right away, and be empathetic. So
right now there's a lot of national discourse about the other, and some individuals feel as though they're not being respected for who they are or for the diversity of their many identities. How is it that through your work or just generally, what do you think America can do to promote a greater inclusion of, tolerance of, and acceptance of difference? How do we go about embracing nationally some of the values that you just spoke about?
That's sort of a loaded question. I think you need a critical mass to push forward progress. Activists for feminism, racial equality, LGBT rights, religious tolerance, racial equality. Those are really big concepts. And I think to do something on a national level, you do need a critical mass. But I do think it is very possible for us day to day just to be good individuals, to treat each other with kindness, to treat each other with respect, to look each other in the eye, to ask people how they're doing and wait to hear them. I think technology moves us forward at a pace that really prevents us from being genuine sometimes because we're so distracted. And I say that as I have my phone in front of me, but we're very distracted and we don't slow down to listen, or we're listening to hear but not to really understand. And I think that if we sit down with people and we listen to understand, we're in a much better place. I think generally just embracing the concept of empathy and giving people the opportunity to speak and share their story, much in the same way you're doing with the podcast, helps us to be better individuals because then we have better perspective. I'm not sure how you do it at a national level. I'm certainly not an activist and I'm not a politician, but what I do think is important is that you start with yourself. You be introspective. You think at the end of the day about how you treat other people. Did the day go well? Did you start off with, a sense of purpose and goals? Were you patient with people? Were you kind? Were you considerate? Do you lead by example? In the workplace, it's a small thing that I do, but I tell all of my staff members and team members, listen, this is a safe space to make mistakes. I'm going to make mistakes. You are too. Let's just treat each other with grace, so that when we do make the mistakes, we can be honest about them and we can keep sort of the ball moving and try not to make them again. But as a team, we can fix the problem and stand in the gap for one another. And I think that is a core value in my workplace, but it's also a core value in life. And so I think we all are going to fall down, but it's important to give people the ability to get back up and to help them back up and to give them a little bit of grace,
So let's talk a little bit about Rebuilding Together in Montgomery County.
Sure.
Why is it, what led you to become executive director of this organization, and why this organization in particular? What is it about Rebuilding Together that gets you going every day? What is it about that organization that helps you live out the values which you've just spoken so eloquently?
So it's interesting. I've got a kind of twisted story about how I got to Rebuilding Together. I was in transition from a great organization that's what we call an intermediary in the nonprofit space, and they essentially fundraise on behalf of other nonprofits and then distribute the funds out to those nonprofits. And they normally do it inside of workplace giving campaigns, similar to the United Way. And I knew that it was time for me to sort of move on and find a new great opportunity. And my role would be shifting internally. So that's sort of what sparked my interest to look outside of that organization at other opportunities. And I had a neighbor come to me. His name is Bob Quinn. He's very active in Montgomery County. And he asked me if I would be willing to consider interviewing for Rebuilding Together. He was at the time a board member. And I absolutely was not. I told him there's no way in the world. I'm not interested in being an executive director of a small nonprofit. The budget that I had managed as the director of marketing for this other organization that I was at was about 4 times the size of this smaller, local nonprofit's budget. And I had always seen peer leaders that were executive directors struggle so desperately for fundraising and for networking and for promoting their programs. That just wasn't something that I was interested in doing. I went ahead and did him a favor. As a board member, you have to have a certain number of recruits come in, and I interviewed. And before I went in, I prayed to God and I said, God, please sort of mark my path clearly and cover me and cloak me so that whatever I do is in your service. And I went into the interview. I didn't realize, honestly, that Rebuilding Together Montgomery County was once Christmas in April, which was really interesting for me because I had volunteered with them as a kid. But as the board members told the stories of the people who had been helped, I started to be able to relate. My father when I was in high school, got very ill, and I became his care provider and had power of attorney over my dad since I was 16. When I moved into a home in college, for rent, I ended up purchasing it with his help and moved him into my house and took care of him. When I went away to grad school, for my MBA, my dad stayed back there, and I had always seen my father as a very strong man. He was able to do anything. He could break a car down to its smallest bolts and nuts and then rebuild it. The same with any electronics in the home. He grew up on a farm, and I think when you're poor, you learn to be resourceful. But on top of that, my dad was pretty brilliant. He's a Mensa, but he's a great mind. And so I left him there thinking, oh, my dad will be fine on his own. And what I didn't realize was that because of his brain injury, he couldn't think the way that he used to be able to think. He couldn't put things together. My father became somewhat of a recluse, and it was really hard for him to live. And he ended up, with cancer. So he had lung cancer. This was my second year in grad school. And it was very difficult for him to maintain the home. And so what became apparent to me was that within the blink of an eye, a person's life can change. He had been sick prior to having cancer, but with the cancer, his body completely, became debilitated. He debilitated very quickly, or his body worsened very quickly. So he wasn't able to walk the same way. He wasn't able to breathe the same way. He was in constant pain. And so he wasn't able to maintain his home. And so the small things that he could do, like, change out light bulbs, swap batteries out, swap out doors, fix small plumbing things in the home if there was a problem with the sink, he could no longer do those things. And so as I was interviewed and these board members started telling the story of their homeowners who needed help, those who wanted to age in place, who may not have had family nearby, veterans who had served our country for years.
It resonated with you.
It absolutely did. And I just realized, wait a minute, these are my family members. They're neighbors in need. And this is how I was raised, helping other people. And so, I left that meeting not really sure what was going to happen, but I ended up taking the job.
So it seems as though initially you were aware of all the difficulties of being an executive director of a nonprofit. It was somewhat, in a way, less prestigious because instead of moving up to a larger budget that you would manage, you were actually dropping down to something 25% the size of what you had previously managed. And you knew that there were difficulties in fundraising and you weren't really that interested in that aspect of it. And it wasn't until you really understood the human stories and really the challenges that you were able to draw connections to what was already a part of your life, which is your father's story. Is that what I'm hearing?
Absolutely. And I think, you captured that really nicely and summarized it nicely. I think the truth is all of us connect the two things because of human stories and interest. Because there's something to the human connection, whether it's touch or sight or sound. When we can hear, touch, and feel other people and connect to them emotionally, we become bound to them. And so for people who already desire to serve, again, whether it's a politician or somebody that works in the nonprofit space, or a child care provider, any of us, I think understanding what the person on the recipient, understanding what the person on the other side of that service needs, and hearing their story makes it a lot easier to serve, even if you're working with less resources, or even if it's a hill that you have to climb to sort of get your message out or be an advocate in that space.
So now you are an executive director and you have had opportunities both. Well, first of all, how long have you been executive director?
So I've been executive director of Rebuilding Together Montgomery County for 3 years and 4 months now.
Wow, that's very precise. So you've had time to build relationships with these individuals in need who you are helping. And you've had time to really settle in and be in this role. Could you talk a little bit about how your perspective has changed over time and some of the stories that you've built and whether your expectations have actually met with your experiences?
So I think it's interesting. In this role, I have the good fortune of touching a lot of different people, not just my clients. And I spoke a little bit to my dad's story. And I think that captures the essence of many of our families that we work with. Something, dramatic happens. They need help. They don't have the discretionary income to help themselves. And so they reach out to us. Sometimes they're referred to us, by a family member or another agency in the county that partners with us. Or sometimes they look us up online. But the stories that I think are most enjoyable are those of not only our funders, but our volunteers. So we work with not only church-based groups, but all faith-based groups, temples, mosques, congregations across the county who are interested in giving back. And so these people of faith come in as a volunteer team. Sometimes they're even businesses who are committed to corporate social responsibility. They come in as a team of volunteers and they work on the homes that we have together. And they do everything from ripping up carpet and replacing the carpet to painting to electrical work. We even do roof repair with subcontractors in partnership with these volunteers. But it's the volunteer stories, I think, that touch me the most, because I think that we walk around each day so consumed with our everyday duties. If you have a child, is taking them to and from school, cooking for them, going to work to ensure that you can pay for things for them. If it's just yourself, sometimes you're focused on yourself and providing for yourself, but our careers, for the most part, take up most of our time. And it's amazing to have individuals come out on projects where they're going to the homes of low-income homeowners and talking to these people and listening to their life stories. The people that are volunteering get 10 times more out of that project than the person that's receiving the help from the volunteer. And I think it reminds me of the importance of working together, the importance of compassion, the importance of giving. I think that we're all called to service. And depending on, what you do day to day, it shows up in different ways. But I think for me, that's the purpose of life. It's to serve. It's to ensure that you and the people around you are doing better, and you do that by serving them.
Now, to some of our listeners, it may be counterintuitive that you receive more by giving than you receive by receiving. Could you elaborate a little bit on what the volunteers really are getting out of the experience? Or maybe you can also take this topic, if you volunteered in other capacities throughout the course of your life, what you found rewarding as a volunteer.
Yeah, so I think for every volunteer, it's different. We just have been working on our strategic planning process within Rebuilding Together. And I'm also the board chair of a phenomenal organization called Nonprofit Montgomery. And it is the association for all of the nonprofits in Montgomery County. And I've heard it within my own organization, but I've heard it from my peer executive directors who also sit on the board with me. The volunteers that come to us expect to be able to help somebody else. But the people that receive the help are actually helping them by sort of reminding them of the importance of community. And I think, again, to the point that I was trying to make earlier, we move so quickly day to day that we become detached from community. But community helps us thrive. And a thriving community is one where people actually work together to make it better and to make it more livable and to make it more enjoyable for all of the members that exist in that community. And so I think when we, touch one person, whether it's in a soup kitchen or whether it's cleaning up the bathroom for, a homeless shelter, which is something Rebuilding Together does, because we don't only work on homes, we also work on nonprofit facilities in the county. I think what we're doing is helping someone else live a better and healthier life. And it gives us pleasure to do that. I don't think we think of it that way, but it does. And you asked me a question about service as it relates to experience that I've had. I grew up in a time where we actually had to do service inside of our schools. But my parents also instilled in me the importance of service from a very early age, and we volunteered together for holidays and outside of holidays too. But I would say one of my biggest service projects was not a formal one. It was a really organic sort of project. And it was just where I had a neighbor who was in need and I stepped up to the plate. I lived in Dallas for a few years while I was in grad school. And my next door neighbor had a daughter who was African American and Mexican American. Her family was pretty prejudiced. They did not, like African Americans. And so it was very hard on her growing up in this household where the family was fairly racist.
I'm sorry, why? So this half African American, half Mexican American girl is living with a white family?
Living with her Mexican mother.
Oh.
And the Mexican family, her mother's family, did not like African Americans. And so because of their prejudices, they were very hard on her. She had 3 different boys. She had 3 other sons by different men. And so this little girl did not have a role model. And I don't know that I stepped into that role thinking I was a role model, but more of a big sister type. Her name is Carolyn, and I absolutely adore her. I love this child. So she was a teenager at the time, and she was in a grade school back in Dallas. She would come over to my house at least once a day, and stay all day on the weekends.
How old were you?
I was in my mid 20s at the time.
So you were a professional.
Yep.
You were working, and then you'd have a teenager come over
all the time
after work.
All the time, yes. And I was at the time the director of marketing for the United Way of Metropolitan Dallas. And it was interesting. I would take her to service projects with me. This kid didn't know what a bank account was or how it worked. Mm-hmm. She had never had one. So we went through the experience of setting one up for her. Mm-hmm. She didn't understand many things that I think you and I probably take for granted. She didn't know what the stock market was or how that worked. She didn't understand the concept of bonds. She didn't understand the concept of exchanging money to go to other countries. She had never flown to other countries outside of being in Mexico. She hadn't gone outside of the United States. There were so many professional opportunities that she had never thought of before. Fast forward, 15 years or so, Carolyn now is living here in DC.
You're still in touch with her?
Absolutely. She moved up here so that she could be with me and go to college.
Really?
Yep. She went to Trinity. She got into trouble at Trinity. We're still working on a few things, but she stuck to it, got back into school. And I am so thankful to Pat McGuire and her entire network community at Trinity. They are so supportive of the young women in that school. But Carolyn was able to stay in school. She graduates next semester. She's got from college. She'll be the first in her family to graduate from college with a B+ average. This year she's on the dean's list.
Did her relationship with her family improve over time?
I think she has learned to think differently about life because she's more exposed.
Have her family members learned to think differently about life and about her and about African Americans?
I don't think they see her as African American. I think that she's doing very well, and I think that they embrace the side of her that they want to embrace. So I think while I don't know that I would say that her family embraces her more because of what she's become, and they relate that, or they understand that she's African American. What I do believe is she is self-aware and she's self-confident. And I think that she understands the 2 cultures that make her who she is. And I think that she feels very good about the woman that she's becoming.
So she's more empowered, but her family remains racist to some extent.
Absolutely. And I think that she's okay with that. I mean, I don't think she's okay with it. It bothers her. I shouldn't say that. But I think she understands. And she's able to stand up for herself. She's able to speak clearly to issues. Her mother actually had a difference of opinion when it came to who she wanted to vote for this past election. And Carolyn was able to stand on her own and articulate why she thought it was incredibly important for her mother to change her position.
Now, how does her family interact with you? What do they think of your relationship?
They adore me. We're all family.
Even though you're part African American.
That's right. I think that they understand it. It's interesting. What I found to be true, and I had the same experience. I can relate to it. My grandfather was very racist. This is my mother's father, a Cuban American. He did not meet me until I was a teenager. He refused because he disowned my mother for dating an African American man and marrying him and having a child with him. And so.
How did that make you feel growing up?
As a kid?
Were you aware of that?
Oh, I was aware. I didn't know of anything else, though. That was my life, And I think I took a lot of cues from my mom. My mom was always so steadfast in what she was doing. She was so committed and so determined. I thought that was the way that you were supposed to be. You were supposed to understand, everyone has differences, and that's his opinion, and that's okay. So I didn't know that there were other options. I didn't know that I could be angry about it or feel disowned or be sad. That's not how I was as a child. I took my cues from my mom, who was incredibly resilient and is still incredibly resilient, and whose internal fortitude was something that I today proudly mirror. So, for me, it was sort of like going to college. It wasn't really an option. I didn't know that it was an option. I just thought that you had to say, oh, that's how granddad looks at me, and that's his choice, and it may not be good for him, but he'll learn. And so when I met him as a teenager, I embraced him. I was very happy to meet him, and I just kept moving. I don't know. I suppose now that I say it out loud, it's probably a strange way to live, but that was the way that the model that my mom displayed.
So as we near the end of this podcast, I'd like to ask you to reflect upon community, which has played such a strong role and continues to play such a strong role in your life. Why do you give so much to your community? Why is community so important to you? And then what is your role within your community?
Okay, say that one more time. I want to make sure that I get it all.
Why are you spending so much time in your life dedicating yourself to improving your community?
I got to go back to my understanding of why we're here. And that really is to serve. I mean, I didn't grow up in a house alone. I didn't grow up with parents who didn't care. I grew up with parents whose approach to raising a child was with great intentionality. I mean, my parents held my hand and always showed me the right way to do things. And they taught me the importance of compassion, equity, respect, kindness, and responsibility, not just with myself and with other people in my home, but more importantly with people outside of my home. And again, I carry those values with me today. I think that we're all here to serve. My mother's job for most of my adult life, and certainly as an adolescent, was to serve. She worked with community nonprofits. She worked with people at the World Bank to ensure that their investments of time and money went to organizations that helped make this community better. So that's all I saw, and that's what I grew up seeing, and so that's what I've become. I think it's incumbent upon all of us, though, to serve. I think it's incumbent upon all of us to care and to be patient and to be kind and thoughtful. And I don't know, I hope to God that my daughter picks up those same values. Her name is Vivian, and she embraces them and shows them in the world. That's my gift to the world, and that's how I serve the most. It's through my legacy.
So that has been Christina Betancourt Johnson, who feels called to serve and seeks meaning through service, and through her service takes her place within a community that is defined potentially by concentric circles of some defined geographically, some defined racially, some defined in terms of service projects or her work. And there's so many different communities in which she seeks to improve the world and dedicate herself to public service. And in fact, one of the greatest legacies, in addition to her work, is her ability to perpetuate that ethos of public service in the next generation of Betancourt Johnsons manifest in the form of her daughter. So thank you so much for joining us for episode 49 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where we interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. We'll talk to you next time.